to this evening's presentation. My goal was to have more people seated there than there are up here with a class of 11, and I think we achieved the goal. For coming here on a beautiful spring evening. I appreciate that. This group of students has been enrolled in the social problems analysis class, and they've done quite an extensive piece of research into immigration, focusing primarily on the local community, but also looking at other levels of analysis such as national and international immigration as well. Their project involved three different main elements, one of which was a service learning component, where they all engaged in at least 20 hours of service learning at an organization that deals with a particular immigrant population. They'll tell you about those organizations in the presentation. And they also conducted intensive interviews of U.S. citizens and their attitudes toward immigrants and immigration policy. They'll tell you about that as well. And they've done a lot of library research, statistical research on immigration as well at multiple levels of analysis. But I'll leave all of that for them to discuss. They, unfortunately, with only an hour's worth of time, you'll only get the tip of the iceberg in terms of what these students have learned. It's a very sketchy overview of the entire class project, so feel free to ask them good questions and such after the presentation. Hopefully we can have a great discussion on immigration. It's in the headlines again, big news at this point. So at this point, we've got 11 speakers here. I'm going to turn it over to Tarik first, but I'd like to introduce everybody. Maybe you can raise your hand. This is Tarik, and Matt, and Eli, Reed, Maisi, Lucreshia, Holly, JC, Danielle, Zach, and Vela. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tarik, who's going to start our presentation.
Thank you, James. I'll be starting our presentation by immigration by talking about current events in immigration. I'll be focusing more specifically on current events on a global scale. Then Matt will be covering national level current events, and Eli will cover local level current events. The first current event that I'll be talking about is proposed reform in Canada's refugee program. Some background information that should be brought to your attention is that Canada accepts more asylum seekers than any other nation in the world. The proposed reform will have government officials hear refugee claims. These claims will then be processed based on the country of origin of the person making the refugee claim. Another part of the reform is that there will be additional funding for the resettlement of newly arrived refugees. The significance of this story is that it's a positive story about immigration. However, Canada is highly criticized for its open immigration policy. Social critics say that it's way too open. Then, I would like to talk about immigration in Greece. Greece is a nation of emigration. There are more Greeks that live outside of Greece than in Greece. And then, Greece is also confronted with illegal immigration. The cause of this is illegal cash-in-hand labor. Greek immigrants from Europe are heavily favored over non-Greek immigrants because of their blood ties. Strict immigration laws that only apply to non-Greek immigrants. The significance of this story is that Greece is dealing with the problem of illegal immigration, just like here in America. However, they're trying to solve it through discrimination. Moving on, I'm going to talk about the Paris riots of 2005. The Paris riots were sparked when two French youths were electrocuted while fleeing police officers in the Paris suburb of Clichy-sous-Bois. The one was of Tunisian descent, the other was of Mali descent, so both African. 3 weeks of riots resulted, and they took place in 274 towns surrounding Paris. The majority of the rioters were unemployed teens, and they were from suburban housing projects. The government response was headed by Nicolas Sarkozy, who at the time was the French Interior Minister. He established a zero-tolerance policy towards urban violence, and many say that the government response tried to link the rioting with legal immigration and Muslim separatism, even though most of the rioters were second-generation immigrant youths. The aftermath of the riots left 200 million euros worth of damage. Some 9,000 cars were torched and destroyed. 2,900 rioters were arrested. 126 police officers were injured, and there was one fatality. The significance of this story is that it shows what can happen when a social problem is not addressed properly. It can cause a state of emergency. It also shows how politicians will try and spin events to further their agendas against immigration. I'll now hand it off to Matt, who will be talking about current events on a national level.
Thank you, Tarik. My goal here is to give you two quick stories, one positive and one negative, on immigration in the national news, and then followed by one main story that is a current headline in the news today. The first positive story that I'd like to talk to you about deals with schools in the New York area. New York schools have created a program called Newcomers, which is devoted exclusively to teaching immigrant students who have arrived to the United States within a year or less of enrolling. The program sends an outstanding 90% of graduating seniors to college who originally spoke little or no English at all. It also works with parents to help them support their students with their coursework and partners with community-based organizations where they go for help and internships and outreach work. I will next slide over to a negative story which occurred in Phoenix, Arizona. The article I looked at was titled, "Hide in Plain Sight, Smuggling Ring Busted," as reported by CBS. Federal agents swarmed over 5 Arizona shuttle businesses in a major crackdown on human trafficking, arresting dozens of van operators and smugglers accused of transporting illegal immigrants from the Mexican border to the Phoenix area. It is known as the largest smuggling bust in U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement's 7-year history, and represented a blow to a vital link in an elaborate immigrant trafficking claim. Currently, 47 arrests have been made. Now sliding into my main current story, which some of you may have heard about, President Obama has now brought up the reform for immigration once again. The article I looked at was titled, "Tens of Thousands Rally in D.C. for an Immigration Overhaul." President Obama is committed to working with Congress this year on a comprehensive bill to fix a broken immigration system. The problems include being torn apart from families, employers gaming the system, and police struggling to keep communities safe. In 2006 and 2007, it was the last time that they tried to overhaul the immigration system. Now that the political climate is even tougher, it will be harder to pass this bill. President Obama gave a 3-legged stool, which includes better border enforcement, more efficient legal immigration, and a tough and fair pathway to legalization that will require the undocumented to learn English and pay fines, among other things. The current bill outlines calls for illegal immigrants who want to get their path to legal status to admit they broke the law by entering the United States. They will pay fine and back taxes and perform community service. They would also be required to pass background checks and be proficient in English before working toward legal residency required before becoming a citizen. More is to come surrounding this issue in the near future, and is bound to have supporters and critics that will always have opposing viewpoints. I would now like to turn it over to Eli, who will be talking about local immigration news headlines.
Thank you, Matt. I want to start off with something positive that I've seen in the media lately regarding local immigration headlines. Valeria Silva, a woman from Chile, came to the United States in 1985 and has been recently voted in as the next St. Paul Public School superintendent. She's most well known for helping to design, develop, and then supervise an extremely successful approach to teaching English to immigrant students who do not speak English in their home. This is really well done because it virtually eliminated the academic gaps between native English-speaking students and those who had to learn the language. She's been so highly praised that the Obama administration has asked her actually to help her to design and develop this program further, to implement it in other cities and other schools throughout the U.S. It's a very huge achievement. One thing that's been more negative that I've seen in the media recently is that immigrants have been involved in human trafficking, and that law enforcement is really paying a lot more attention to this. Although we don't know the actual number of cases or individuals involved in human trafficking, 19 cases since 2007 have come up in the Twin Cities. The highest profile case has been when ICE agents or Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents broke up a prostitution network of 8 brothels within the Twin Cities, mostly in apartments and houses throughout Minneapolis. And really what's unfortunate is these traffickers are withholding documentation from those who are being trafficked. And so those who are being trafficked feel that they cannot go to officials who are the ICE officials because they deal with both human trafficking and immigration. And so they feel that they're trapped in this position. But one thing that's really positive that many of those individuals do not know is that victims like these in the brothels are immediately given visas to stay in the United States for a short period of time and can eventually apply for permanent residency. Unfortunately, again, racial tensions have really risen in St. Cloud specifically, so much that students at St. Cloud Technical High School created a Facebook page called I Hate the Somalians at Tech High in early 2010. This really didn't surprise the Somali students because they had received racial discrimination from U.S. native-born students frequently, and often in different attitude by the teachers and the staff in the school. Students actually have reported such things as being told that they stink, Somali students, excuse me, being told that they stink, and some of the students are going as far as spraying perfume or cologne as these individuals leave a room or walk by. And tensions such as these really are arising in places where the demographics are changing. And specifically in St. Cloud right now, in the school district area 742 in which Tech High resides, Somali students make up about 10% of that student body. The student population in District 742 right now is around 100,000 students, so 10,000 Somali individuals are a part of that. Much of this tension, as I've seen in my research and as well as that I've heard from my peers, is this tension arises from a lack of communication. People who are not able to speak the same language, specifically, in this case, English. And so something that's been highlighted in this case again specifically is that those U.S. native-born individuals are targeting students who have either just come from Africa or who generally do not speak well. And again, this is happening in many places where the demographics are changing. I'm going to pass it on now to Lucreshia, who will be talking about the theoretical framework for understanding immigration.
Thanks, Eli. For the theoretical approaches to immigration, I will start with the conflict or critical perspective and move on to the social constructionist perspective. The conflict or critical perspective, traditionally, as introduced by Karl Marx and Max Weber, claims that all institutions are interrelated and have an influence on one another. But the economic institution is identified to have the most influence on the lives of people, both individually and communally, with people either owning and controlling businesses or working to benefit those business owners. These two positions develop into opposing socioeconomic classes. The social or class conflict comes out of the imbalance of systems where the elite few control and make decisions for the majority. The competition of economic resources develops into a conflict in values and interests, which essentially means that people with access to economic, social, and cultural resources have different and opposing views and values than those with little or no access to economic, social, or cultural resources. These values and interests are seen as positive or negative depending upon what is constructed to be right or wrong, which leads us to the social constructionist portion of the theoretical approach. The labeling perspective is the process of defining a social problem or deviant by social reactions to an alleged violation of rules and expectations. These rules and expectations are conditions that are culturally and socially defined, or better yet constructed as normal or average. And the social problems or social deviants are seen as a deviation or move away from the norm or average. They are troublesome and changeable. So what does all this mean in relation to immigration? It means that the structure of institutions is vital to the way people's intentions are perceived and responded to. When people immigrate to a country or this country, it is easy, because of the process of labeling as deviant, to place them at a distance of the other. This happens because the values and interests of us seem different and opposing to the values and interests of them, which further perpetuates the conflict. It's all circular. Now my C will be speaking about the history and demographics of immigration.
Thank you, Lucreshia. I will be talking about the history and turn of the decade with the highest immigration and the demographic of where our immigrants are immigrating from. To begin looking at immigration, immigrants have been coming to the U.S. decades ago. However, the top 4 decades for the highest immigration, in which 3 out of the 4 decades concentrate on the immigrants study. So the first decade with the highest immigration is from 1991 to 2000. And Somali and Hmong were among the immigrants that were immigrating during that decade to the United States. The Hmong were coming because they were the remainder refugee in Thailand. And the Somali were coming because they were fleeing from the civil war in Somalia. The second decade is from 1901 to 1910. The third highest decade is the first wave of Hmong refugees immigrating because of their involvement in the secret war with the CIA. And last, the fourth decade, this is when the great number of Latino immigrated because of labor shortage during World War I and the growth of agriculture opportunities spurred. And then moving on to the demographic, first we're going to be looking at the chart of immigration in the United States. In 2002, there's a total of 1,063,732 immigrants. A majority of our immigrants are from Mexico, as you can see on the map with the darker green color. The reason more of our immigrants are from Mexico is because it's near U.S. Therefore, they're crossing over to United States because of more opportunity and better school system than they have in their country. So second majority of our immigrants are coming from countries like India, China, Philippines, Vietnam, Canada, and Russia, which is the next dark color green. So we just look at immigrant as a whole in the United States. Now we're going to focus on immigration to Minnesota. The majority of our immigrants in Minnesota are from India, Somali, Mexico, China, Vietnam, which is the darker red color on the chart. To examine more in Minnesota on the 3 immigrant groups that we're studying in Minnesota, we have the largest population of Somali immigrants, the second highest population of Hmong, 60% of our Latino and native-born U.S. citizens. From the Minnesota 2000 census, the population of Somali is at 11,674, Hmong population is at 45,443, and the Latino population is at 108,445. Now to focus on Augsburg population, which you can find the chart on the first page on the handout. Out of 2,046 gay college students, 68% are white, 8.3% are African American, 7.4% are Asian, and 3.7% are Hispanic. To conclude, immigration in the future, there will be fewer immigrants in the future because of post 9/11. Minnesota is becoming less welcoming, the recession, and fewer jobs. Now I'm going to turn it over to Reed, where we'll be talking about the labor and the social economic background of the immigrants.
Thank you, Maxie. I'd like to start by focusing on the economic impact of these 3 groups on Minnesota, the Twin Cities, and the U.S. overall, and move on to the socioeconomic background. There are over 1,000 Mexican American businesses located in Minnesota alone, generating over $200 million in sales. Anchored by the Mercado Central on East Lake Street, over 200 Latino-owned businesses can be found in the surrounding area. The economic development of the Hmong community is due to their entrepreneurship and cooperative efforts. In Minnesota, the Hmong population generated an estimated revenue of over $100 million. Many businesses can be found on University Avenue in St. Paul, which also helps stimulate the local economy. Over 120 African-owned businesses can be found along Minneapolis Lake Street corridor. Unfortunately, since professional licensure is not recognized in the U.S., many African immigrants with professional skills end up working jobs in manual labor. In context of the unemployment rate, in the past few years, as you can see in table 3 behind me in bold, the increase in job losses for immigrants during the recession is 1.8% higher than for native-born citizens. In the year 2012, in 2002, the percentage of unemployed Hmong immigrants was about two times larger than for U.S. citizens, general population, and 3 times higher than for the population for Minnesota and Wisconsin. For socioeconomic background, the education level, once in the U.S. of immigrants, is lower than for native-born citizens. In the year 2000, between the 3 groups in the study, the Somali community had the highest level of education. 66% of the Somali population had at least a high school education, and 22% had graduated from college. The Hmong community, on the other hand, was the least likely of these 3 groups to have gotten to have a high school education or a college degree. Almost half, 45.3%, have no formal education, compared to 1.4% of the U.S. overall. In terms of income level, as is indicated in bold in Table 16 of your handout, native-born citizens per capita earn 45% more than new immigrants. In the year 2000, the household income for Hmong communities was only 63% compared to the rest of the U.S. population. In 2008, the median household income for the Latino community, was about $41,000 per year. Half the population earned less than $20,000, and almost 20% lived in poverty. Hmong Minnesotans have relatively high home ownership rates, although they're still lower than average, or significantly higher than other recent immigrant groups. In 1990, 90% of the Hmong community in the U.S. were not homeowners. Over 10 years later, the percentage of homeowners increased by about 4 times nationally and about 5 times in Minnesota and Wisconsin. The percentage of Latino homeowners, however, plummeted from 60.8% before 1990 to 19% since the year 2000. Lastly, household size for immigrants is larger than for native-born citizens, as is also indicated in bold in Table 16 of your handout. For example, the Hmong community have an average number of people 3 times greater than that of the rest of the U.S. With comparing between the 3 groups in our study, members of the Somali community are the most likely to live alone, representing 48% of the population, representing 17% of the population. Members of the Latino community are the least likely to live by themselves. So as you can see, each of these groups have their strengths and their weaknesses and adapt differently to American society. But all are shaped by broader structural forces that are subject to change over time, for better or for worse. Now Holly will speak about the service learning component of our study.
So as James said before, each of us has contributed over 20 hours of service at 3 assigned organizations. The organizations are the Franklin Learning Center, the Central Cultural Chicano, and the Jane Addams School of Democracy. Each of these organizations, there is an empirical concentrated focus on a specific immigrant group. The Franklin Learning Center has a high population of Somalian immigrants. The Central Cultural Chicano holds a Hispanic community, and the Jane Addams School holds a higher demographic among the Hmong population. Each organization contains a mission which describes the context and the aspirations of the presented organization, a culture which describes the norms, values, beliefs with an organization, and a set of goals in which each organization sets for themselves in order to thrive and aspire for an exceptional and successful institution. Josh and myself will discuss each organization and these common characteristics that each organization shares. And we'll also discuss the strengths and weaknesses. To begin, I'm going to be discussing the Franklin Learning Center. The mission of this organization is to provide adults with the necessary resources to educate themselves. It provides a vibrant cross-cultural learning community, and the learners are empowered with the knowledge needed to fulfill professional, family, and community roles. The goals of the organization is to provide the necessary resources. They also thrive on further learners to achieve U.S. citizenship and to prep for GED testing. Another common goal is for the learners to speak English. The culture of the Franklin Learning Center, it's 75% of the learners are originating from Africa, in which 70% are Somali. But it does offer a wide range of demographics as well. The strengths of the Franklin Learning Center, they have an exceptional, knowledgeable staff and volunteers. They do thrive on the achievement of their learners, and they do meet their common goals. In the past 5 years, an average of 340 learners studied over 14,000 hours. In 2008 alone, about 194 volunteers contributed over 8,000 hours. And a little under 150 learners have gained U.S. citizenship. The weaknesses of the Franklin Learning Center that I found, the structural dimension is very sporadic. The Franklin Learning Center has very little specialization among volunteers, and the tasks are very unorganized and may be confusing to the volunteers, and the staff isn't always available to help guide the tutors. So now I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and he's going to be discussing the other two organizations.
Thank you, Holly. I'll be talking about the Central Cultural Chicano and also the Jane Addams School of Democracy. To start off with the Central Cultural Chicano, the mission of this organization is to engage and educate Latino and Chicano families in Minneapolis while using their culture to strengthen relationships. The culture of this organization is very strong, and they focus on their Latino and Chicano roots. They have a strong staff to maintain and influence their culture, and they incorporate parts of their culture, like traditional dance classes and events, to maintain that culture. The main goal or purpose of this organization is to engage the surrounding Latino community with education, socialization, and means to be successful in this environment. Another one of their main goals is to stop the flow of young adolescents dropping out of school, and to achieve that goal they have the Truancy Prevention Program, which promotes school success. The strengths of this program are that it is very strong in engaging Latino and Chicano youth and families. There is a great culture within this organization which helps the youth develop and build relationships. And they also do a very good job of incorporating some of the values of American society into their own culture. The staff is also very qualified to work with these children, and they're all fluent English and Spanish speakers. Another one of their strengths is that they know the needs of each student, which is very important. The weaknesses of this organization is that it's highly unorganized. Some volunteers reported having little effect on the organization with no real tasks to help. The structure of the organization is also weak, and it needs more direct leadership. So now I'm going to be switching focus, and I'll be talking about the Jane Addams School of Democracy. Their mission is to free and cultivate the talent, cultures, and interests of people from diverse backgrounds and traditions in order to add their energy and wisdom to the common public wealth of all. Their culture is that they believe that everyone is a teacher and everyone is a learner. They also believe in honoring all cultures, specifically the Hmong, Latino, East African, as well as other cultures. They also believe that adults and children learn together, and they believe that positive changes can happen when people work together. The goals of this organization, the main goal is to develop and build community relationships with socialization and also education, as well as helping their community members achieve citizenship. The strengths of this program is that it is highly effective in developing Hmong and others in their goal of citizenship and development. To help them gain citizenship, they have specific programs towards that goal, and they also help, our members are able to stay in the programs until they gain citizenship. And they also provide necessary resources to the community, especially with regard to socialization. The weaknesses of this organization is that it lacks authority and leadership. There's also a very small staff, which is reliant on volunteers, and the language barrier of volunteers to the students can somewhat be a problem, but they're able to work through it. And now Abela and Zach will be talking about the interview data.
confidential interviews with United States citizens. These interviews were recorded, transcribed, and coded by us, and they offered a substantial amount of data to be analyzed in our quest to understand and answer our questions about immigration and individual immigrant groups. The questions that were asked of these citizens were broken down into a few main categories. The interviewees were asked about their personal experience with immigrants, their attitudes and the attitudes of others toward immigrant groups, immigration policy, and their interaction and experience specifically with either Somali, Hmong, or Latino immigrants. We worked hard on creating the best possible questions, all of them asked in the same format, but the answers that we received were very diverse. As you can see on the handout, we had a majority of male interviewees. The racial majority was white, and within the age category, 56% of the interviewed people were from the ages of 18 to 29. Concerning political affiliation, we had 30% of people identified as conservative, 19% as moderate, and 51% as liberal. Although all the people interviewed did not specify what their actual political affiliation was during the interview, it was incredibly interesting how their political leaning changed as the topic in the interview changed. For example, some people interviewed would have specific policy recommendations for individual immigrant groups, which correlated with their personal experience with that group. Also, some of the people interviewed would have a more liberal attitude towards cultural exchanges that occurred with immigrants, but a conservative attitude towards towards potential economic and institutional benefits of immigrants. There were very few interviewees that had a concrete liberal or conservative attitude that was maintained towards all of the topics that we asked them about. After analyzing the interviews, it was clear that people's perceptions of immigrant groups are shaped and affected most by their personal contact and experiences with them. In almost all interviews, there's a clear pattern of the more contact the interviewee had with an immigrant group, the more accepting they were on policy recommendations towards that individual group and also towards immigration as a whole. A main constraint of the interviews was the pressure of being recorded for the interviewees, especially when asked about immigration policy recommendations. People often mask their own perceptions and feelings by stating them as perceptions of other United States citizens. Another main constraint was people's individual experiences. Many of the interviewees had contact with Latino and Somali immigrants, but had little or no contact with Hmong immigrants. The final constraint of these interviews was people's lack of knowledge about the naturalization process and our country's current immigration policy. People had significantly less to say about questions pertaining to the current policy, but that limited knowledge did not affect the amount of things they had to say as far as recommendations or alterations that they would make to the immigration policy that we have here. And now I will turn it over to Zach, who is going to talk about a little bit more about analysis that we made of the content of the interviews.
Thank you, Abela. Okay, so briefly I'm going to touch on a few of the general tendencies that we found during the interviews. First, as Abela already mentioned, there was a lack of knowledge about the Hmong population. The people that did have knowledge about the Hmong tended to have gained it from either media sources, which often contain more stereotypical type information, or direct experience in work and school. But outside of those people who had direct experiences or limited media knowledge, there wasn't very much. Another tendency was a static view of immigration. People see immigrants as coming to this country for and just staying here for. There was no room for economic progress or change throughout time, so they wouldn't see aid as necessarily benefiting the immigrants. They just see them as a poor population which would stay poor. In addition, nearly everyone, whether they were conservative or not, claimed to have a cultural benefit for immigration, but a lot of this was based on things like food or more abstract things. So it wouldn't be any personal contact or real in-depth cultural experiences, but rather just things they would go and experience briefly before returning home. So I'm going to shift and focus on the perceived positive and negative factors associated with immigrants and what types of groups those things fall into. So with the perceived threats from immigration, there really were three major categories people explained. One was economic burden, a cultural threat, and reducing crime from immigration. So I'll give you an example here of the economic burden. When asked what comes to mind when you think of immigration, this was one response. What I think of is the argument of we have to keep the Mexicans from coming to our country. We have to build a fence or a wall across the southern border because there's too many Mexicans coming in and taking our jobs. That's the first thing that I think of. That's really the big issue that's out there that I really think about, because if you let them in, they're taking our jobs. They're living off of our welfare. We're paying for them, and we have to pay their medical bills. You know, we're losing money because of all these people coming in and living on. you know, being lazy, not getting jobs, just living off of us. I don't think that is necessarily the case, but I don't know that that isn't necessarily the case. But yes, that is the issue that comes to mind when I think of immigration. So here you see how they're pointing out that immigrants are coming to the country and taking the jobs that Americans are needing. Another argument about perceived threat from immigrants was based on the cultural threat. And this really happened in two ways. One, immigrants would come in large numbers and kind of take over the native culture. And another was that they would come in and isolate themselves and not contribute economically. So here's an example of that. This is an example of kind of the takeover type perspective. There's things that come up that kind of get to me. Like in Iowa, there was this meatpacking plant that really the whole town is now kind of being taken over, if you will, by Mexicans or illegal aliens. And I know that's one particular place that has a lot of Mexicans. So here there's a large availability of jobs. So a large influx of immigrants comes in, and the people that are living there, seeing this on the media, see that as a hostile takeover, that the immigrant culture is threatening the culture that was there previously. And the second type was for isolation. Here's an example of that. I would repeat myself towards the Latinos. I have no problem with them. They mix, they embrace America and their own culture. Whereas the Somalis are doing everything they can to keep themselves separate from the American culture. They don't like us, they don't. And this is a general statement because I've met some wonderful Somalians. They're sweet and gentle and kind and educated and work really hard. Unfortunately, I've seen a handful of families that want absolutely nothing to do with us. They stay together, shop together, do whatever they can do to make sure they don't speak English around us. They support their own shops and do whatever they can do to bring their own culture to the forefront. So this type of argument really overlaps between cultural and economic. Saying that they come in and try to create their own, or maintain their previous culture within the United States, and in that way don't contribute to outside culture. The third tendency was less common in the interviews, but it was the view of immigrants as producing crime. So here's an example of that. I think most U.S. citizens would view it as obviously a bad thing, for work morals and work ethics and stuff like that, and sort of pride for their country. I personally feel that it's a bad thing, and they need to do things right, because we have created and have such a great country. We've worked hard for that. We have been working for that since we have been born, and in our history we've been working for that. If things get worse with immigration, especially with crime rates and stuff, it's really hard to say that it is a good thing. It seems like more of a bad thing if in the long run it hurts us and ends up killing us, or killing someone we love or whatever. So here the immigrants are seen as a group of people coming into the country for and only contributing to their crime, and again, not contributing economically. So for perceived benefits of immigration, there are two very similar categories. One was a cultural benefit, and the other was economic benefit. So here I'll read you an example of the cultural benefit. So the question was, what effects, positive or negative, do you see immigration having in the United States? Here was the response. Well, that should be absolutely obvious to every single person, because look, we have spaghetti and meatballs, we have pizza. When did that come over? It came over to Ellis Island with the Mafia, the Godfather, and Marlon Brando. In the 1920s. We had an incredible wave of immigrants coming from Europe. Food is just the beginning of it. So again, this is an example of the cultural benefit of immigrants being seen as food or something. So it's not real in-depth personal experience, but rather something to go out and experience and then come back home and really be isolated from again. Here's another perspective on that. I appreciate walking down the streets and hearing a bunch of languages, and when I don't hear it, I actually miss it now because of where I live. I can go to the coffee shop down the street, and there will be 10 people speaking a language I've never heard before, or would never be able to understand. I think that's really cool. I think in some ways it makes life more difficult if you don't live here. But I have a great disdain for people who feel as though people who come here as immigrants need to know English. It bothers me a lot. So here's another example of cultural benefit, but again, this wasn't a real in-depth experience. He was talking about the exposure to a language he didn't understand. So it's not a real personal connection between immigrants and their culture, but rather just the presence of that. And here's for economic benefits. Positive. I think of immigration gives us cheap labor. I don't think taking advantage of anyone is a good thing, but unfortunately that cheap labor allows, or has allowed us to build our infrastructure through our history. I don't necessarily agree with that. So this is really close to the previous argument about immigration. Instead of being seen as an economic burden coming to this country and taking our resources, they're seen as contributors, taking the jobs that nobody else wants. But at the same time, they're being exploited because of that. A lot of immigrants being systematically forced to, because of poverty, work in jobs in the U.S. that don't have fair salaries, that don't have workers' benefits or worker protection, and also don't accredit the worker with the majority of work they do. That's not to say every job, but a lot. So doing some immigrants really having to do jobs that other people would not do. Not all, of course, but So the infrastructure, the economy, I think our economy would be completely different if we would not have the work of immigrants. So again, they're being seen as coming in, filling the jobs that we need filled that other people don't want. And in that way they're seen as being economically beneficial. So now I'm going to pass the presentation off to Danielle, who will be tying together the presentation through the theoretical framework.
Thanks, Ed. All right, so what we've seen in the previous interviews, data, and current event headlines are responses to immigration. So to sum this up, I will revisit how these responses fit into a theoretical framework. The theoretical base tells us that structure shapes society and eventually the social problems that involve. So we saw this at the beginning with traditional class conflict, which is conflict between two different socioeconomic status groups. Ultimately, at the core of this conflict is a value conflict. So each group has different values, and those are what is actually in conflict with each other. And from these values, labels are created. So for maybe a more poor working class, you hear that they're lazy, and for a wealthier class, you'll hear they're greedy, things like that. So these labels eventually turn into us versus them attitudes. And this is where it really becomes applicable for immigration, especially here in the U.S. We definitely see, feel, hear this us versus them kind of culture that's been created. You know, we are here, we are born here, this entitles us to certain things. They are not that, they are not entitled to certain things unless X, Y, and Z happen. So this structural influence of what a government has set out for politicians can be defined both globally and locally, beginning with why an individual or group is leaving one country to enter another in the first place. So these intentions on the part of an immigrant are perceived and interpreted by a government, eventually becoming a structural climate. And this climate, or the public, reacts to this climate in various ways. So in Canada, they accept more refugees with asylum status than any other country in the world. And so then the public says, well, they're too lenient, they're too liberal, they need to tighten it up. In Greece, they've decided to take sort of a ethnocentric kind of stance where people with Greek blood are favored over those without. So it becomes discrimination, and those without Greek blood are seen as less than others who do have that. And in Paris, you have the rioting, where a certain group of people, immigrants, were isolated to one certain area, and when things kind of got ugly, these riots happened in response to that, because you know these people are isolated in the lower income part of town, and people respond to that. So here in the U.S., it's legal accountability. When an immigrant comes here, you know, they can come here and we think that's great, but they have to go through a very specific process. And if this process is not followed, we see that as deviant. It's wrong. They are breaking the law. They're criminals. They're all these things that we are not because we've been born here. So our interviews kind of highlighted how these labels and this us versus them attitude actually become threatening. We are threatened by this. One of the threats was economically, so that was in terms of jobs. We are threatened that these immigrants are going to come in and take jobs away from people who are born here. We're culturally threatened, particularly in terms of language. We really want people who come to this country to be able to speak English. If they don't, that's something that we're not comfortable with. That further separates them and further marginalizes people who are immigrating here from people who are born here. And then finally, there's a little bit of a safety threat where we feel that perhaps people who are immigrating here are adding to the crime, they're increasing crime rates, so committing more crimes than people who are born here. And these are all stemming from this larger structural climate of, because they're not doing this, they are this. So because they're not following the legal procedure, they are breaking law, they are criminals, they are not us. So, and one possible way to break down these generalizations is through close personal contact with immigrants, which is something that came out of our interviews like Abela highlighted earlier. So why is this important? What does this mean for you? What does this mean for the public? If we continue to only focus on the response to immigration without further examination of how these perceptions are formed, progress in solving these social problems is nearly impossible. Becoming aware of both the immigrants' experience as well as our own in receiving them is significant because all of these events, processes, and reactions are directly going to translate into